questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for a million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas to explore the past and create a brighter future together. I'm Thomas Westbrook, and I am joined today by two magnificent co-hosts, Rachel Oates and Stephen Woodford. Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Now, this episode is talking about whether or not we can predict the future and whether or not we can do so accurately. So I'd like to place a wager with both of you, or either of you. Will you take me up on this bet? For $100, I bet that I am going to drink from this cup of coffee that I'm holding in front of me. Is that a fair bet?
Wow. Okay, so elucidate a little more. So what is the bet exactly?
So I have a cup of coffee in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm betting that at some point in the next minute, I'm going to drink from this cup of coffee. And is that a wager you'd be willing to bet against me?
So I think me and Stephen should team up, and he should say yes, and I should say no. And then either way, one of us gets the money, and then me and Stephen split the money, and you lose out.
Done. Well played, Rachel. Well played.
Then we all break even.
Yeah.
Oh, damn it. No, what?
Now, hang on, because you'll end up losing $200 because you'll have to pay each of us.
Wait, if Rachel bets that you don't, and I bet, or you bet that I will.
So did you say you bet $100?
Yeah.
Would we bet $100? And let's just say that. Oh, I guess you'd only have to pay Rachel, of course, because I would be wrong in that. Yeah. Okay. Good start.
Well, but I'm only taking the side that I'm only betting that I will drink from the cup of coffee.
Mm.
So if you bet that I will too, well, I'm still, winning the bet. No one's going up against me on the one end, and then on the other, I'm making $100. So either way, I'm now drinking from the cup of coffee.
I see. Yeah.
And it wasn't really a fair bet because I, in that situation, was the puppet master for the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to determine, to a large extent, I mean, there's a very slim possibility that I could have fallen over and had a heart attack and never gotten to actually partake of this delicious caffeinated beverage. There's a possibility that right at that moment that someone would have opened the door and knocked over the coffee or something. There's a lot of things that potentially could have happened, but the probability of them was low enough, and the probability of me having enough control to actually drink from this cup of coffee was pretty high. And based off of that, I was willing to wager that, I was going to drink from the cup of coffee. So it's not really a fair bet. To that, in that regard, I was to a small extent able to predict the future. What are
you
some
was able
examples?
To create it.
Exactly. What are some examples, though, of methods of predicting the future that don't work? People who say that they have some type of prophetic gift, some different tactics that they might use to say that they can see into the future. Can you think of any?
Reading tea leaves.
Tea leaves, that's an excellent one.
Reading palms of someone's hands.
Oh, yeah.
Palmistry is another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tarot cards.
Tarot cards,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Basically, all of this pseudoscientific religious crap.
Mm-hmm.
The stars?
Yes.
Yeah, astrology would fall into it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we know that they can sometimes be correct, but this is due to probability and, of course, Barnum statements, etc., which we've covered in another episode.
On psychics, yeah. So there's a couple of others. Bibliomancy is when people try to look for cryptic messages in the Bible to predict the future.
Yeah.
Crystal balls or crystallomancy.
Yes.
There's... I'm probably butchering this pronunciation, but a neuromancy is predicting dreams, the future based off of dreams that we have.
Just curious, do you know what the mancy is?
What were the last two letters!
B as in butthole.
What do we do here?
And M as in Mancy.
What?
M as in what?
Nancy. What'd you think I said? Nancy!
I'm often quite interested in just the way in which words are, their structures. All of those had Mancy in it. I was just wondering if you knew what Mancy is.
Is
Like when
it
someone has
something to do
ology,
with, like,
it means research.
Spiritual or magical, maybe? Because, like, necromancy is, like, raising the dead, right?
So Mancy just means divination by a specified means.
Oh.
That helped.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of crazy ones. There's people who will, like, look at sticks that are tossed on the ground and try to predict the future based off of that. There's you talked about like tarot cards and palmistry, but just looking at objects in patterns in the day-to-day world to try to figure out what the future is like, it doesn't really work so well because the world is a complicated place and lines on your hand don't really have a whole lot to say with whether or not you're going to be successful.
No,
the stock
Thomas,
market might,
you were just
whether you get
skeptical.
sick or not.
You're just skeptical. You're too skeptical. Your bad energies disrupted the process.
I see. Well, there's a bunch of
chestnut.
crazy ones. There's one, it's like Heru spicy is by the livers of sacrificed animals.
Oh.
Hydromancy, which is looking at water. There's looking at gems or stones, which is lithomancy. There's so many different, like necromancy by the dead or the spirits or the souls of the dead. The list goes on and on and on of, different ways that people think, by the entrails of animals or by the flight patterns of birds. Astrology is by the movement of celestial bodies. There's also astromancy, which is just by the stars themselves. I don't know exactly how it works. And then my personal favorite, electromancy, which is the observation of a rooster pecking at grain. Because nothing tells whether or not you're going to be successful or not. Besides whether or not the rooster chokes on a piece of grain.
Did you say it's called electro?
Like Alectro. Electro.
I thought for some reason you said as in electrical. It's like, what how does it get to that?
I mean, I guess if you sit outside all day watching roosters eat grain, you're probably maybe sitting in the sun too much. And
I was going to say the rooster's probably
none.
like a trained electrician, but it's just me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he does that in his spare time.
It's like when they were staring at the chickens, you should have read a book instead of just staring at the chicken. Like the end result is that you think the chicken is magical.
Yeah. But we are pattern seeking creatures. We look around us for patterns and we try to figure out if like, oh, whoa, this happened this many times in the past. Maybe it'll happen again. Or this person said this and it came true. Maybe their next prediction will come true.
Or like people who look for faces in things. It's like a...
That's called pareidolia.
Yeah.
There's some problems though for predicting the future like this. For, trying to just seek random abstract things and try to correlate it with some other future thing that's completely unconnected. Can you think of a couple instances where there have been failed predictions or failed, based off of spurious pseudoscientific Mancy type things?
The world is going to end in...
the world.
Yeah. The 2012 one especially. That was like the end of the Mayan calendar, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there have been failed doomsday prophecies going back thousands of years. Literally, back to before the time of Christ, there were, the world is ending, and every single one of them has been wrong. There's been several that have happened this year alone. There's a televangelist named Harold Camping who has gotten at least 6 predictions wrong in his lifetime. And he has quite the following of people who every time it happens, they'll think that the world is ending, and sometimes they'll pull their kids out of school and start just homeschooling them Bible verses in preparation of the end times, only to find out that the world didn't end and now their kids are woefully underprepared for life.
That is child abuse.
Yeah.
I'm probably skipping too far ahead here, but you can predict that guy who's got it wrong 6 times is going to get it wrong again, because you can infer from the fact that he 6 times got it wrong.
But he comes back equally confident every single new time.
Oh my gosh.
So aside from that, there's also one of the most famous, kind of infamous characters when it comes to predicting the end of the world or future events is Nostradamus. And it kind of initially looks a little bit shocking when you start reading through his stuff and you start seeing these predictions and people say, look, he predicted Hitler, and he predicted 9/11, and he predicted George Bush, and this and that, and this and that. And they start pointing to all these different predictions. And at first glance, it seems like, whoa, like he did kind of, and like this means that. But then you start actually kind of looking into what his quatrains say. And they're almost always some vague, you'll hear something that says like, the eagle will crush the leper or will crush the snake or something. And they're like, oh, the eagle, that's America, because eagles mean freedom and America's freedom and it's the symbol of America and yada, yada. And they have to layer all these abstractions on top of it to try to find these patterns.
Yeah.
The problem with that is if you write enough vague sounding verses like this, then given enough time, you're going to be able to fit anything from history into it, into one or the other of your little quatrains. And because we're surrounded by hundreds of different events happening all around us that we're aware of, and over the course of our lifetime, and you have hundreds of different verses to plug into all these little cubby holes, it's not too hard to then come along and after the fact say, look at how successful of a prophet this guy was. But if you were to actually go back in time and ask him, hey, in an hour, what's going to happen? Or what year are you going to die? Or things like that, he probably wouldn't have so, hot of a success rate. A good example of this is, are you familiar with Satya Sai Baba?
Oh, is this the old woman?
No, he's the Indian guru.
In that case, no. I'm getting him mixed up with someone else.
He amassed a following of millions of followers in India and around the world. And he would do things like he would pull these little pellets out of thin air, like little magic tricks, sleight of hand, and allegedly did all these miracles. And he's obviously a con man, or was. He's dead now. But one of the things that he got very wrong was the date of his death. And he predicted that he would die at a certain age, and then he died well before his time.
Yeah.
And now his followers are left to try to explain away somehow why, oh, he didn't literally mean this. It was some figurative interpretation. It's easy to find hoops to jump through. But when you get down to concrete predictions like this, most psychics and prophets and fortune tellers and gurus, they don't have the best hit rate.
Yeah.
Another example, though, is psychics. And one of the most famous psychic predictions is that of the psychic twins predicting 9/11.
This is so bad. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I haven't
really
heard of
mad
this.
about
This is I'm
Rachel,
excited.
you want to talk about this a bit?
Yeah, so I've covered this on my channel as well. Basically, their biggest claim to fame is that they predicted 9/11 and they did it on this talk show, on this radio and blah, 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 and they go on and on about it. And then you go back and you watch the actual show, and basically it's just them saying, yeah, so what year was 9/11? It was 2001. Yeah, they actually got the year wrong, didn't they, by like a year or something. I think, and they were like, oh yeah, so we see some terrorist attacks in like the next however many years, and we think it's going to be in this country and this country and this country and this country, and in the US it's going to be in this city and this city and this city and New York, and it's going to target this building and this building and this building and the Twin Towers and this building and this building, and maybe it'll do this, and maybe it's so vague, and they get the date wrong. It's like one thing in a list of like 100 other things, and it's really vague, it's really stupid, and then they have the goal to be like, oh yeah, we predicted 9/11. It's like, no, you didn't, you just used common sense, because there were already like threats of terrorist attacks. There'd already been a threat on the Twin Towers.
There had already been a bombing at the Twin Towers.
Oh, had there? Yeah, there you go then, that as well.
There was a bombing in the early 90s.
Yeah, and so it was just like, it was a mix of just common sense and general knowledge and being really vague about it. And then they have the goal to be like, oh, we predicted 9/11. It's like, no, you're just trying to make money and make a career and exploit like the biggest tragedy that, there had been in years. Yeah. Sorry, it makes me really angry, this one.
No, you're right.
I went back and wrote down a list of like, I went through and I listened to their entire, it was on the Art Bell, I think it was Coast to Coast, I could be wrong, but a radio show. Right. And they go through and they start just talking about what the future is going to be like. And they say that there's going to be an AIDS cure by 2002. And that Christopher Reeve, one of them said that they didn't think he would walk again. The other said that they thought that he would, and that there would be a cure for him. And but then like he died before there was. He was paralyzed, by the way. And they talked about like us making public alien contact by, I think, 2009 or 2012. Like, I don't remember the exact dates that they gave, but they go through like one ridiculous claim after another. And there's this whole list of them. I think they said, like, was it Quebec that was going to separate from Canada or something in a particular year, and it didn't. And like all these things that they just got so abysmally wrong. But then they have one event, and that's that they said in 2002 that there's going to be a terrorist attack on a bunch of federal buildings in several states and the World Trade Center. And that's all they said. But then they come back after the fact. And even though the World Trade Center was one of the largest threats and that terrorism was on the rise, that there had been multiple terrorist organizations that had been speaking out against the U.S., that had been targeting the U.S., that the World Trade Center is kind of a symbol of democracy or more, not democracy, but more capitalism in America, American values and the American dream. And so it was already a massive target. And for them to say that it would happen, but then they get the year wrong. They didn't say that it was going to be Al Qaeda, but then afterwards, I think they had an interview. I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I saw an interview where they were
trying to claim
mentioning that they predicted that too, and that they said it would be an airplane, which they didn't. But it's so easy after the fact when you make 1,000 predictions to point at the one that you got right, and then try to pretend like you got it so much more accurate than you actually did.
Yeah, I see.
But in actuality,
I was going to say I see two massive factors there. The first is, evidently they threw so much shit at the wall and then they just focused on what stuck. And the second thing being just cognitive bias, confirmation bias, etc. Like people were just focusing on, oh, this kind of fits, and just ignoring all of the grotesquely weird and wacky and very much wrong claims that they made, and just focusing on the ones which they can fit into the context of, you know, what's actually happened. It's one of the worst parts about humanity for me. That pattern-seeking need to be able to, you know, put the circle through the square hole. Just, it does my head in. Yeah.
It's so easy after the fact, though, to make stuff fit. On the Nostradamus note, I made a video called "Can Prophecy Predict the End Times?" on Holy Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And I talked about how Nostradamus... apparently, like if you look at it hard enough, you can find a quatrain that makes it seem like he predict Kim Kardashian. And I was like, Century 4, quatrain 25, the heart of the lover, awakened by furtive love, will ravish the lady in the stream. And it's like, oh yeah, they're streaming on the internet this image of Kim Kardashian, and and I like went on with it, but it's like you can find all these little caveats to try to make something fit based off of like wording and multiple meanings.
Yeah,
and...
you've got me thinking. Actually, this is largely why I refer to Jordan Peterson as the Deepak Chopra of Christianity, and that is that he does this with Christian text, with the Bible. He just reads it in this really wacky way and then somehow brings it into the purview of what we now know. So all of a sudden, God doesn't mean an actual God. It actually represents, our intuitions. Or Jesus' resurrection doesn't actually mean Jesus' resurrection. It means a resurrection of the mental stability of his mind or something like that. He's basically reading into it in order to make it fit with the facts. Drives me nuts.
It's like
Sam
GCSE English, when you like read into a text and you're like, oh, the blue curtains show his depression. It's like, no, he's just describing how the room looked. It's like, if you want, you can twist text any way you like. Especially when it's as sort of like metaphorical and as like the Bible is. Do you know what I mean? As flowery and...
Have you seen Sam Harris do the same with a cookery book?
No.
I can't do it justice, but
that sounds good.
I don't remember it properly, but he basically just, goes into a bookshop, picks up a random book. This was him criticizing Jordan Peterson. I just thought it was great. And he opened it up and he had, the ingredients and the way in which to make I don't know what it was. It might have been a muffin or something. And he was saying, you can read this with this kind of mindset and see great value in it. You can go, oh, look, it's telling you to mix the pepper and the salt. Well, the pepper represents black people and the salt represents white people. It's only together that you can get the truly tasty goodness that is the muffin. It also says that you should take 4 parts this, and it's just like the way he does it is hilarious. But it's painfully hilarious in the sense that it's really funny, but also this is the shit people are doing.
Yeah.
You can find seeming deepness in just about anything. But
Yeah.
what are some methods though of predicting the future that you guys can think of that actually work? Like some methods of predictions that happen around us that we see all the time that actually make pretty accurate predictions.
Volcanoes.
Volcanoes?
Like predicting when they're going to erupt. Like people like
Aren't we pretty crap at that?
No. Well, maybe. We can still do it to some extent though. Like as in maybe not like 100 years in the future, but we can like predict when the activity is starting so we know to evacuate people.
Can you think of anything that we can predict like 1,000 years out?
Oh.
We can predict solar eclipses.
Yeah.
With absolute precision, thanks to Einstein's special theory of relativity. I believe it's that one, not the general. Basically, for me, prediction is, when we're talking about prediction, we're talking about inference. Because, you know, you can see from the facts that something else is going to happen, and then you can make a prediction based on those facts. So you know how I was quite facetiously saying that because that guy's been wrong 6 times in predicting the end of the world, you can infer that he's probably going to be wrong on the 7th. That is a prediction that's based on evidence, that's verifiable, that's objective. You know, this is, again, the realm of science. So if I'm walking across the floor, it could be some grass, and as I'm walking across, first 5 steps, it's solid, you know, mud, grass. I can predict that the 6th step, I'm not going to all of a sudden fall through the floor. And this is not the best of predictions, and I could be wrong, but it's a prediction that's based on said evidence.
That's slightly fallacious in that, like, let's say that I give you a coin to flip, and you flip it, and you get 7 heads in a row.
Yes.
You could make the prediction that, oh, it's always been heads, it's going to be heads again.
But the facts are different when it comes to the coin.
At the same time, you could say, "Oh, it's been
hang
heads."
on. I want to tackle you on that. So there's a 50% chance when you're flipping the coin for it to land on a head and a tails.
Yeah.
And do you think there's a 50% chance that you're going to fall through the grass?
No, but that's more. It's more based off of, you know, we test the world around us and we start to see that, you know, yeah, you do look at patterns from the past and you look at what has always been constant and what has never violated the laws of physics. And so it's like, yeah, it's probably not just going to suddenly change and all of a sudden the world just disappears and poof, you're in outer space.
But that's a prediction you're making, right? Based on previous events.
Based off of past experiences. So to a large extent, that's true.
But I think I know the point you're trying to make. The thing about the coin is that it is 50-50, right? Or,
I'm talking about more like the guy's accuracy rate. Harold Camping's accuracy rate is like, maybe he's the 7th prediction is all of a sudden right. But it's more in that case, it's more his reputation is the basis of his lack of accuracy.
Yeah. So let's say that I just predict you're flipping a coin and I get it right. There was a 50% chance of me getting it right in theory. That is a very, very high chance of just being able to arbitrarily decide tails and it's going to land on tails or heads. But if I was to predict that all of your 7th step on the grass, you're going to fall through it, it's not going to be able to take your weight. That's not 50%, because we can infer from everything around us that doesn't happen. The chance of that happening is really, really small. So I think it's more a problem with the analogy that I have, because I know that you can't obtain, absolute knowledge or even perhaps sufficient knowledge to be able to make such a statement. Because for sufficient knowledge, you'd want to actually step on it to be able to go, I know that this will take my weight. But you can't. It's not the same as flipping a coin.
I think that the difference there would be like kind of with the earlier coffee example. You know, based off of past experience, I know that I have pretty good control over whether or not I'm going to drink this coffee in a moment, unless something absolutely just completely unusual happens. I know that there's a high probability I can.
But you've added another factor in, and that is that you're in control of the circumstances, whereas you don't control the penny, that's the point, and you don't control whether or not you're going to fall through it.
Well, the comparison that I'm making is like with the grass, you have a pretty good understanding of every time that I walk on grass, nothing ever happens. Whereas with the coin, it's like the comparison or the difference I'm wanting to point out is that the past doesn't change, it doesn't change the probability of the outcome. So me walking on grass and the grass being able to support my weight, the first step and the second step pretty much have equal probability of holding up my weight. Whereas with the coin, it's always 50%, and the past probability or the past circumstances don't change that. So me getting, 7 heads in a row, it's still 50-50. Me getting 7 tails in a row, it's still 50-50.
And is it 50-50 that you'd fall through the ground on your 7th step? Yeah, okay.
No.
So maybe I'm getting confused with the points you're making, because I do understand the point you're making about when it comes to coins, there's no, like someone will roll, for example, a D6, a 6-sided dice. They'll roll 5 of them and all of them land on 6. And they go, what's the chances of that? That's amazing. And I have to say, it's the same as any other roll. And that's hard for people to process because they don't understand that is the probability of the matter. It's just you're arbitrarily putting value on it all being 6s.
Yeah.
And the coin is a great way of putting that across. It's like, okay, we've had 5 times it's come up with heads, 1 time that's come up with tails. What do you reckon the next flip's going to be? You haven't got a clue. That information is useless. But that's not the same when it comes to the inference of walking on grass and then your next step, whether or not you're going to fall through it, being a 50% chance kind of thing.
It's like the probability of you getting 6 heads in a row is the same probability as you getting heads, tails, tails, heads, heads, tails.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Exactly.
I want to talk though about some of the so we know that you can predict eclipses based off of scientific equations, that we know how objects interact with each other. We know the science behind how they work to the point where we can land a rover on a comet. We can predict when comets are going to return based off of their speed and their trajectory around the sun and whatnot. And we do this accurately. We predict when the next ones will come, and we see these patterns happening because they're cyclical. And so, we look at those cyclical patterns, we look at cyclical change, and we see, okay, every single day the sun rises at this time, it's, this much later until we hit, the summer solstice or whatever, and then, we start seeing these patterns all throughout nature, and then we start writing laws, or equations that figure out the laws of how the universe works and how it behaves according to these laws, and how it creates these cycles according to these laws, according to how much mass they have, according to their gravitational pulls on each other, and all these other aspects of science. The question is, if you could create a computer that can it goes down to the very atomic level, and it can figure out exactly where every single electron and proton and neutron is, their speed, their direction, every single attribute about them. Would you be able to predict, starting with the Big Bang, start to finish, how the universe would end up, its end state?
So this is Laplace's demon, right?
Yes. The contrast of, or the opposite end of that would, if you start at the very end and the state of everything, could you extrapolate backwards and figure out exactly how it all started?
I have an answer, but what do you reckon, Rachel?
Does this come back to the whole free will thing?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Because the first part of me wants to be well, no, I don't think you can predict the future even if you have all this information, because people can still change it. But then what we said in the free will episode, everything you put forward about how we don't really have free will and how a lot of things aren't really our free choice, kind of makes me think that, yeah, maybe it would be possible to predict it, but
for me,
I don't know.
There's a distinction to be made, because you're right. It so easily is relevant to the discussion of free will. In order to have free will, you need to be the conscious agent behind your thoughts. Your thoughts need to emerge out of your consciousness, not something else. So whether or not the world is deterministic or random has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not you have free will. I think that's the main point I want to get across, and that is that we know that your conscious decisions are determined by prior causes. Whether or not those prior causes are determined is absolutely irrelevant to whether or not you have free will. So I'm very certain on saying you don't have free will, and also randomness wouldn't give you free will anyway.
Yeah.
But
how? how do we know that things like are really completely random? Like, take the toss of a coin. That's still determined by so many different things, from like, you know, where it was when you started throwing it, like the wind speed and direction around you, like how hard you throw it. Surely if you can put everything into the computer, you can predict what's gonna happen, and then you don't really have real randomness.
There are computers that have been, or robots that have been built that can flip heads every single time.
Yeah. And I didn't know that. That's quite cool. But basically, randomness is an area of information where we can't make accurate predictions. That's basically what it is. Some computers can. So, you know, if I flip a coin and I flip it gently, I can predict what it's going to land on, because I can know how much force I'm putting into it and whether or not it's going to land more likely the opposite face than what I'm flipping it on. Whereas, or even better, if I drop a coin, I've got a really good chance of predicting what it's going to land on because I have more control in it. But when I flip it and there's just more variance and it's just really fast flip and I haven't got the capacity, the knowledge, the ability to know what's going on, there's wind, there's all sorts of areas, all sorts of factors coming in, it lands, and for all intent and purposes, it's random. It was a coin flip. But Laplace's demon would necessarily have that knowledge. And so I guess the deeper question is, if it had all of that knowledge, it would be able to predict the coin. Of course it would.
Well, that comes into chaos theory too. It's like one tiny little change in the angle of your flip or the wind speed or something could completely radically change the coin, how the coin lands. And depending on if it lands heads or tails, if you're making a decision, it could alter the rest of your life.
Yeah. But as soon as you said chaos theory, it reminds me of butterfly effect, of course.
Yeah. I mean, the butterfly effect basically takes chaos theory and says, like, let's say that you go back in time and you just step on a butterfly, then that could change the entire outcome of the future.
Yeah.
Totally could. Yeah. Absolutely could. Because, you know, as we were saying in the episode about free will, you know, your aggression towards someone in your car could be traced back, if you had the variables and the knowledge and the insight and the ability, it could be traced back to your cereal not quite having enough vitamin B12. You know, we know this can happen, or your diet being deficient in zinc. This is ridiculous, but it is the case. It is absolutely bizarre. When it comes to your question, though, Thomas, you were saying about, you know, it can know all about the atoms, the protons, the neutrons, etc. Would you also say that it knows all about the quantum world as well? Like in its entirety?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Because, so Laplace's demon, for any of our listeners who don't know, is basically, Laplace put forth this idea of, what if there's a mind that could know everything about the universe? Could it predict every single outcome based off of initial states? Now, at the time, they didn't really have a concept of a computer, so they called it Laplace's demon, go figure. But you can do the same type of thought process with a computer. Now, when you start getting into the quantum world, it becomes more complicated because in quantum mechanics, there's basically a concept called quantum indeterminacy, which is that it looks at the world of the super small, and it looks at I'm not a quantum physicist, so I hope I don't butcher this. But basically what it tells us is that things like light behaves as both a particle and a wave at the same time. So if you're trying to measure the momentum and the location of a photon, you can know, like, the more certain you become about its momentum, the less you can know about its position. And the more that you know about its position, the less you can know about its momentum. So you can never really have perfect knowledge on something like this.
So I heard a very, very good point by Neil deGrasse Tyson on this, because I was confused by this, because to me that's telling me that there is some kind of random factor in the universe. But the way Neil deGrasse Tyson put it was, you know, if you drop a penny down in your car and it gets wedged between the seats, the very act of putting your hand down to grab it moves the coin, and it can fall further down. He was saying that that's what's happening with the double slit experiment, etc. And so it's not that it's actually random, it's that we have no ability to measure it without disturbing it. And so it is random for all intent and purposes. I just
Well,
wanted to throw that out.
A good visual for it is, let's say that, I'm staring at a mug right in front of me, right? A mug of coffee.
Oh, don't call me
What's
that.
happening is these photons, they're bouncing off the mug, and then they're bouncing into my light. Or no, sorry, the light is bouncing into my eyes.
Mm.
And based off of, the wavelength of the light that's hitting me, I can see different colors, and I can kind of get an idea of like the shape and the depth of this coffee cup. Well, when you're trying to measure something in the quantum world, like imagine that you have a handful of tiny little microscopic pellets, and you can toss it at an object. Well, you can look at where do those objects, like let's say that I throw a ton of different objects at a car, and I do it from all these different angles. Well, even if the car is invisible, I can see how all the objects bounce off of it, where they bounce off and stuff, and kind of get an idea of the shape of this car.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as you get smaller and smaller, you get to a point where you're no longer, you're smaller than what you can see visually. And you start having to use like electron microscopes. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking an electron and you're shooting like electrons against particles to try to get an idea of its shape and position. But when you get small enough, you get down to, the quantum level. Well, the very act of measuring it, of, tossing something, shooting something against it, is going to change its direction. It's going to change its position. It's going to alter it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so you can never really know with 100% certainty.
So this is interesting. Does that mean that we could say, perhaps, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, we could say we can't know everything, and therefore we can't have access to this predictive power. However, there's nothing that rules out. In fact, the evidence still suggests that the world is deterministic. That
Possibly.
everything is deterministic.
I'm not going to make that statement because I don't have enough information.
Yeah, this is the difficult thing. Of course, we often go into territories where we're not too sure, and we could do with experts. And of course, even the experts in quantum physics say, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't. And so it's just a very interesting field and hard to get my head around. But so far as I've read everything, there's nothing that violates determinism in this, what you would see as a Newtonian universal clock kind of thing. And if you actually had access to the clock, you would be able to tell what time is coming up and at what time.
Yeah. I mean, there's some things like, radioactive decay and whatnot that like, I don't like to me, it seems completely random, like which particles are affected. It seems there's certain aspects of quantum mechanics that they do seem very random to me. I don't know if there's something behind it that's determining it that I don't know about. I don't know if there's some factor that we're missing. And, I don't even know if that's known by, a particle physicist.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the larger scale world, the world of, predicting when a comet's going to return, predicting solar eclipses, predicting when our sun is going to run out of energy and burn out, these are things that we can predict and we can determine. And the array of possibilities, like the range of our predictive abilities, is constantly expanding with our technology. As we learn more about how the world works, as we gain certain social knowledge about, the scientific world, as well as we get better tools to measure it and to predict it, and better equations to determine how the world works, our predictive abilities increase.
Yes.
But will we ever be able to have a computer strong enough and powerful enough to predict everything in the universe, even assuming it's outside the quantum level? Like let's completely ignore, and I know this is a huge stretch, but let's completely ignore the world of quantum indeterminacy and quantum randomness. Let's just look at atoms, and let's, just from that level up, let's assume that that's all that affects it. I know that that's a massive leap, but bear with me. Would it still be possible in that circumstance to create a computer that would be able to predict everything in the universe? Yes or no?
I don't see principally why we could say no to that.
Rachel?
I don't know. I don't know.
I would like to posit that it is completely, utterly, absolutely, abysmally impossible.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Because transistors are made of atoms. And bits, whether something is a 1 or a 0, a yes or no, on or off, it's determined by atoms. It's built up by atoms. You need multiple atoms to represent, or to create a transistor. And there are, I can't even come up with a number so big to talk about how many atoms there are in the entire universe. If you're going to represent all of the atoms in the universe in a computer, you would need a computer bigger than the size of the universe itself. You would have to have more bits to represent every single atom. And not just to represent the atoms, but you have to represent their speed, their position in space and time, all of these different attributes of the atoms all throughout the universe would have to be represented using bits. And so you would need more bits to represent them than just 1 bit per atom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I'm thinking of a few objections, but they're deteriorating as I think of them. Yeah, I think practically it can't happen, but in theory, it could.
The one objection that I would throw forth is if you had a universe that was extremely low in entropy. So let's say, right after the Big Bang, the universe was in a much, there was a much less entropy. And this in that state, like let's say that everything is kind of crunched into one small area, and let's say that it's all kind of a uniform temperature, and that it's only helium and hydrogen atoms or something like that. Well, that is much, much, much easier to represent using compression. Because, and an example of that is like, let's say that I have the word, or I have a sentence, and the sentence is Bob, 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 Bob. Well, you can compress that sentence just by saying repeat Bob, right?
Yes.
Just in a computer. Like I know I'm not getting into programming so much, and I don't want to. That's a whole nother area. But that's a really, really simple way to compress something. Is basically you have a repeating pattern, and rather than write it out 1,000 times, you just do Bob times 1,000. And suddenly, any computer could come along and recreate, this sentence with a bunch of Bobs in it. So if you have all of the same elements, and you have all of this, everything is very uniform, it would be so much easier to create a simulation of a universe like that. The problem is, as you add information, as you start having, all of the matter start, forming into clusters and spreading out and stretching out, and then, all of the pressure forming stars that then, fuse into more and more complex elements, and they start, you start adding these levels of entropy, you're adding amounts of information. And the more information that you have, the less you can compress it, the more different it is, the bigger a computer you would need to simulate this.
Would there be a possibility that we end up making computers that are smaller than the quantum realm? That let's say that we discover that there's something even below the even below quantum mechanics, and we somehow figure out how to create, essentially computers using that technology. Would then you be able to do it, or?
I haven't thought about that. If at that level, that micro, sub-quantum level, if you could have, bits representing atoms, maybe, depending on how deep and how broad this sub-quantum level goes, maybe. You would still, you'd have your work cut out for you gathering all of the information about the universe. But at
maybe
the same
in
time, in theory, potentially, the question is the subatomic world, or not subatomic, but subquantum world, also affecting all of this stuff? And if it is on a macro scale,
you'd have the same problem where you'd have to be able to
have the same
that,
issue.
Right? That's true.
So
actually,
that's an interesting question. But needless to say, the more information that we gather, the better our predictive capabilities become. So right now, we're not able to figure out where all the atoms are. But if I take a cluster of trillions of atoms that's a bowling ball, and I look at how, the angle that it's thrown at, and the speed that it's thrown at, and the amount of air resistance and friction and everything else, I can figure out where that bowling ball is going to go. to a certain degree of accuracy. And the more accurate my measurement gets, if I'm able to measure the weight of it down to like, 0.000000001, grams, then I'm going to get, a more accurate prediction to, 0.00000, however accurate my initial measurements were. That's how accurate my prediction can be.
Yep.
So we're getting more and more and better. That's why like weather predictions 50 years ago weren't as good as weather predictions now.
Yeah.
But there's still probability. So when they say there's a 90% chance of rain, that means that 10% of the time it's probably not going to rain. They don't want to just say a blanket statement of yes or no, because they know that there's so many different factors in the weather that can cause, precipitation.
Yeah, so it's like degrees of knowledge, degrees of predictability based on what available access to to Laplace's demon they have. So when it comes to stepping on the grass, you have more information, you have access to more facts, so you can make a better informed prediction than the weather, because there's so many factors and it's a lot more complicated and it's hard to be able to predict it. And then you change that to you can extend that to pretty much everything. It comes down to probability, right?
Yeah. So for example, if you're a farmer and you, to some extent, how the future is going to turn out. You know that if you plant seeds in the ground and that the ground has enough, nitrogen and fertilizer, nutrients, whatnot, and it gets enough rain and it has enough sunshine, then these plants are probably going to grow, unless there's like disease or something that eats it or whatever. And so you plan out your entire life based off of, I'm going to keep planting this, I'm going to keep doing this, because there's cycles of, certainty.
Yeah.
That, you see these cycles throughout nature and you predict the future based off of it. Now, could you predict though that like, 10 years from now, a cow is going to come along to this spot and drop a cow patty right here? You'd have to have a lot more information in order to make a prediction like that, because chaos theory starts, affecting every tiny little aspect of it.
Exactly.
There are some things though that we know aside from cyclical change, which is like the weather patterns and, comets coming back and solar eclipses, like aside from cyclical change, there's also linear change. And linear change looks at things like, okay, we look at the last 100 years and we look at human progress, we look at human tendencies, we look at human psychology, and we know that if I am a company and I want to sell a product to you, and there's already a product that's pretty good, and I offer one that has half as many features at twice the cost, you're not going to buy it. If you have access to information about these other products, you're not going to buy my crappy, subpar, featureless junk. And so I know that because humanity wants better and better and better and better goods, and because we want it to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, we know that the next, iPhone is either, it's going to have, either more storage space or a faster processor, or it's going to be cheaper or something. We know that it has to be better or more affordable.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, more linear change. We can kind of predict the future based off of that. So we can look at, what is the future of technology going to be? And well, it's probably going to be faster. It's probably going to, because you look at like Moore's law and you start extrapolating forward, based off of our understanding of computer chips and, based off up into a certain limit.
Has Moore's law kind of died out a bit? I heard someone saying it.
So.
I haven't really looked into it. I didn't know if that's the case.
There's predictions that it's going to eventually, just because there's a limitation on, the size of transistors.
Yeah.
But then you start getting into quantum computing and its possibilities for, continuing Moore's law out even further.
Yeah, I see.
But either way, we look at technology and we can, start trying to make predictions about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And this is...
I was just going to say that all of this predictive ability with basically physical, non-conscious elements around the universe, we can and we do. We extend this to humans and to thought in general. And I'm not just talking about the free will aspect, although I guess I kind of am. If, psychiatrists, when they see a child and they notice that child is in a very abusive relationship and they notice certain personality traits, they can predict that they're going to very likely hurt someone when they're older. They might murder, they might rape, etc. And when they do find people who have committed atrocities of this ilk, they have so many commonalities, such as they're almost always from an abusive family. They've almost always been bullied. They almost always struggle with society. That's kind of working backwards, but you can also, because of that, work forwards by looking at children now and seeing how their environment is, because it is a good prediction on what they're going to be like when they're older.
Well, but I mean, then too, human relationships are so subject to chaos theory as well, because maybe they were bullied and stuff, but then maybe they had a really nice person that came along and helped them and reshaped their worldview.
Exactly. So it's not something you can make definitive, because there's too many things, there's too many variables, but
it is something that we can start looking at and saying, because there's a strong statistical correlation between people who've been bullied, well, maybe we should get rid of bullying. Maybe that'll drop it by a certain percent. Maybe that'll drop, violent rate.
A lot of crime that we see, one of the best things one of the major predictions you can make, I say predictions, it's more of a hindsight thing. You see someone that's come in, they've committed a crime, you can bet that they've had an unfortunate upbringing. And you're going to be right 95% of the time. And so you can infer from that that's not just a correlation equals causation fallacy, that there's something going on there. And so you can work in the reverse and see people in a bad situation and go, we should fix this because there's a good chance this may happen.
So I wanted to touch on a little bit, talking about whether or not, we can simulate the universe, or simulate, to try to predict the future based off of the universe. That kind of leads me to think, or to feel, believe, whatever you want to say, that we're not living in a simulation. Ooh. Because the size of the computer required to simulate something like this would just be unthinkably huge, unthinkably massive. The one exception, can you think of any reasons why I might be wrong?
Yeah, I'm just free thinking here, so you tell me where I'm going wrong. We create, World of Warcraft, and we have servers, and so that's like, that could be a simulation. Is that a simulation? Kind of, yes. We don't need. I don't know what this has to do with knowing all information, etc. You don't need to. You just create the simulation. So we could be in a simulation with the atoms that we have and everything that's happening. I don't see. I'm struggling to understand. Maybe you need to elucidate a bit more.
So when I look around me and I see the world, I see everything made up of atoms, and I don't see the actual atoms; they're too small. But I can look under a microscope and I can see what everything's made of. I can test it. I can look at the stars. I can see, measure their distances, and I can, this world is just so massively huge, and I'm surrounded by people whose brains are made of neurons, and I can look at that and examine all the states and get all this information about the world around me. That is a massive amount of information that we're seeing, but that we're observing all around us.
But relevant to what?
In order for this to be in a computer, for a computer to simulate this, it would have to be, absolutely gigantic just to create all of this information.
If you had conscious entities in a video game, let's just say that we get to that point where we can create conscious entities in a video game, or just in some kind of simulation, they would look around and they would notice that there's actually laws to their universe. They would see that it's complicated and that they might be able to break it down and actually realize that there is a lot more attention, a lot more detail than what they recognize. So their version of quantum mechanics, etc. They may even have determinism. But for them, would it be wrong for them to then say, this is too complicated, there's too much happening here, therefore we can't be a simulation?
Would they, though? Like if a video game character,
in this case, we know that they're not that they are a simulation because we made it. But what I'm basically doing is applying your logic to a game that we've hypothetically made.
But if a video game character were to go and analyze and break down stuff, would it actually see, atoms that are, dictated by quantum mechanics, or would it see polygons? Would it see pixels?
It depends on the computer again. So we're making assumptions on it being a computer like the way in which we conceive it. We're making assumptions on many things. So when you go in a game and you very quickly travel to a new area, sometimes the textures start rendering and it's very slow, and all of a sudden then you've got the graphics, and that implies that you moved there too quick or the game was too slow. Some people have said that we get the same, or have hypothesized that we have the same when we're looking at the quantum world. There's nothing there until you look at it and you really pay attention, and then it's there. And this is also to do with measurements.
That kind of breaks down to the fallacy of the quantum world that we were talking about earlier, that it's not the act of observing it that makes it so. It's that measuring it, like the act of measuring it, affects it. So like, it's not that the quantum world doesn't exist until you measure it. It's that when you measure it, that the photons themselves bounce off, or the electrons bounce off the particles that you're trying to... But it could be
in the simulation, their interaction by moving into a new area to observe something is a form of measurement, and therefore it then renders.
Okay, I could actually see that. I could see
it could be the same for us.
If I'm in a simulation, but only like this room right now is simulated, and this conversation with you guys is simulated. But then as I advance into other areas, then it has to render each room in each area.
Yeah, because although you have really good reason to think that you're not the only human being or the only entity that exists, there's all this objective evidence. Ultimately, it comes down to, as we said before, I think, therefore I am. It's this subjective state. And so it could be the case, it's improbable, but it could be the case that every single person outside of this conversation that you're having now has just stopped, or they're not rendered. It could be the case. And then as soon as you get outside, all of a sudden people are rendered and they interact with you, and it seems like they're having the same experience as you. There's nothing to rule this out. And so there is a possibility that you are in a simulation. Is it probable is the more interesting question. And what the hell can we do about it? I don't think there is anything you can do about it. So I got to say, for me, I think it's still possible that it's all a simulation. But I don't operate on that because it's nonsense.
When I go to sleep and I'm dreaming, it's basically the computer is expending less resources, and that's when it's like, needs to reboot.
Yeah, essentially, although you could argue that it's actually spending almost no resources anyway, because it's only rendering the area near you. Yeah. Because everything else is basically off. There's no NPCs, as they call it. The textures aren't rendered because there's no need for it.
Well, it's like your brain is much, much smaller than the universe itself. But when you choose to think about one particular aspect or one complicated aspect, your brain can conceptualize it, but it's only doing one tiny part of the universe at a time. So when you guys, like Rachel, when you close your eyes right now and you think about a galaxy, what are you thinking about? What do you see visually in your mind?
I just bought some galaxy print paper to make a scrapbook, so that's what I'm picturing.
Okay. Steve, when you think about a galaxy, do you see any visual?
Yeah, so in my mind, I see a collection of suns, and they're intertwined, and they are orbiting around one another, essentially, or around
how many
mass.
Do you see?
How many do I have as a concept?
Do you see
billions.
The trees or the forest?
Do I see the trees through the forest? Did you say?
Yeah, like do you just see the kind of the overall thing? Like when you conceptualize it, are you just seeing like this cluster, this blob, this uniform, just like one object kind of?
Yeah, to me it's not a blob. To me it's a spiral. It's an enormous amount of basically lights in like a spirally shape, and you can see through it. But you're really not close, maybe
thinking. You're not thinking about individual planets in that galaxy. You're not thinking about individual elements on those planets until I draw it to your attention.
Yeah, until you draw it to my attention, I'm not thinking about them. Your focus
is zoomed out. So to kind of give the comparison to the computer, your mind is only rendering the one object, this giant, galaxy, this abstraction where you step back and you see the whole. But then when you start thinking you start drilling down, then it's like you no longer are focusing on, when I was telling you to think about the planets and the elements, you stopped thinking about the overall giant galaxy and you started focusing in deeper and you started looking at them one by one. But you don't have the bandwidth, the mental bandwidth to focus on every single planet, billions of them at once, to draw them all into focus in your mind and to think about them all at the same time and to think about all the elements. Your brain just isn't powerful enough to process that.
Yeah, completely agreed.
So if you were to have a simulation, it would be something like that. It would have to focus on little parts at a time, little bits at a time, and it could have certain laws and certain formulas and equations that dictate how the world around you works. But only as you encounter it would it be able to render each section.
No, not necessarily. So when you enter a new area in a game, especially an MMO, so a massive multiplayer online game, it renders everything. And you may walk into that environment focusing on the trees or whatever it might be. It's still rendered everything near you. So if you then switch your attention and look around you, you'll also see the benches or NPCs or whatever it might be. And this is just the way in which we render our games. We're talking about a hypothetical situation where they can render it in any way they want, ways that we haven't even considered, way far ahead, with technologies that we couldn't even fathom. You go back a while about, 50 years or say 100 years, they would look at what we have now with our simulations and think that's never going to happen, and yet it does. And, to me, I just can't rule it out. It's, what you're saying here, I guess, is that you don't agree with Descartes, that all you can really know is I think, therefore I am. Would that be an accurate thing?
I mean,
because if you can also say this isn't a simulation, then that's something else that you can say with certainty, which I don't think we can.
What I'm saying is that if you assume that everything around you is some form of information, whether it's stored only inside your brain or whether it's stored elsewhere or whether it's stored in a computer,
right?
You start to examine the complexity of it, the complexity of, all the different textures and what is required for you to be able to synthesize that into a visual image in your mind and to feel it and to smell it and to experience it. And you start just looking at how absolutely astronomically complex a room is, much less the entire universe. In order to accurately simulate that, unless you're rendering just one tiny, tiny, tiny portion at a time for one person who's experiencing it, as you get billions of people who are all experiencing, stuff like that too, and sharing experiences, and there's overlaps. If those are people and those aren't just avatars.
Yeah, you don't know. You can't say that the others are also having all of those complications, though, can you?
But they're able to have intelligent conversations about the information that they're taking in and experiencing as well. So there has to be some additional information.
Yeah, so that's just a different manifestation of information. It doesn't, because what you're describing about the mind having like an incredible amount of processing power and ability to tap into things, that's not required for everyone else. They just require to be able to talk to you. So I don't actually have to have all of this mind and this ability to conceive everything in order for your worldview, or in order for this scenario in which you are the brain in the vat, you are in the simulation. In order for that to make sense, all you need is for me to be able to sufficiently converse with you. And then after you turn off this podcast, after we finish this conversation, I just shut off because I'm no longer rendered in the simulation that is Thomas Westbrook. So I don't, of course, think any of this is true. It's just I can't rule it out because of the nature of proof and the way in which absolute knowledge works. I can disprove it in the sense of it being for you, but I can't for me. I should probably reword it.
I mean, it is possible that like everyone else that you encounter is some type of intelligent avatar that's able to pass a Turing test, that's able to seem real, that appears to experience emotions the same way that you do, appears to respond to stimuli the same way you do, and appears to gather new information. So if I talk to you a week from now and I ask you to research a particular topic and you come back and you've gathered this information, it appears that you're having experiences as well. It appears that you're able to gather information as well. Everything seems to scream that the world is more complicated and that there's other entities having other experiences.
Yes, it does.
There's so much information that's being taken in, not just by me, but what I'm seeing other people share with me and how they're able to have different...
with NPCs, the computer avatars in games, you talk to them, you get a quest, you run off, you go do what you've got to do. You then meet them again in a certain environment within the game. Again, these are just computer bots completely, and they're really rudimentary. They've got more information. They've looked at things that you may have asked them to look at. They've got, all this information. They can converse with you over what you've learned. They can help you plan. But really, As soon as you left that area, that unit just vanished. It wasn't rendered. It was just dropped. And yet that illusion of they were doing something is there because it's convincing enough for the game. There's nothing to rule out that could be the case in the reality that we experience. Again, I don't think that's the case. I'm not convinced that it's the case, but I do recognize that you can't show that that's absolutely not the case. And because of that, you have to unfortunately say it is possible that this is a simulation. This is Steve's simulation or Thomas's simulation.
Technically, you're right. I think as much information as we experience just as one person, I have a hard time conceptualizing a computer that is powerful enough to make all of that happen.
And one more thing I'd add on top is that. Yeah, I was just going to say one last thing I'd add on top is that let's say this is a simulation and you're judging, whether or not this could be a simulation based on the technologies and the rules of this universe that we inhabit, this simulation. There is nothing to say that the universe that created us or the maybe even the simulation that created our simulation has the same rules. In their rules, they could have the complete capacity to put us into a tiny little watch or a mobile. We could be a mobile app. You could be the Thomas mobile app because they have different rules. It's like super quantum mechanics. So
quantum machines creating smaller quantum machines.
Yeah, like it's like
we're quantum turtles all the way down.
Yeah, like we're deep in philosophy here, but it's fantastic. This is what philosophy does.
Well, that's why I wanted to cover this topic, is because it's so vast, and it's like, I'm not a quantum physicist, but
me neither. Just
conceptualizing this, a computer big enough to actually simulate our universe. Now we may be in someone else's simulation, but assuming that we're not, assuming that our entire universe is real, if we were to try to represent our universe in bits, that would be impossible. Because you would have to have a computer bigger than the size of our universe.
Well, if we wanted to represent it, or them.
Yeah, if we wanted to represent our own universe and every single atom within it in a computer, that would be physically impossible.
Yeah, I need to think that through more, but I think you might be right there. I hadn't thought about that, but when you said it, I did think, I see where you're coming from here, because you can't get smaller, so therefore you would have to use the same size bit. So I think you might be right there.
Now I feel bad. We've been going off and we haven't really let Rachel weigh in.
I know, we are terrible. We are terrible co-hosts.
So Rachel, I want to ask you, one of the best ways that we have been able to kind of predict the future is to first conceptualize it. And you'll have people, especially science fiction writers, started coming along in around the 1800s, and people like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and they would put forth these ideas of like what the future would look like. And I was wondering if you could think of any examples, maybe, of examples in science fiction where a science fiction writer has thought of something that either did come true and we're like, whoa, it's like they predicted the future, or they thought of something, and it could be like Star Trek, it could be a book. They thought of something that's like completely off from how reality actually turned out. Can you think of one of either? So I'll give you an example. So in Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury, he predicted earbuds, and he basically called them thimble radios, where it's like a tiny little radio that you stick in your ears and you're able to listen to audio.
I guess in 1984 they predicted like the screens, like the TV screens
with the cameras on them.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Steve, can you think of any?
I was just thinking that this is so not a thing I thought about much. And I'm not huge into sci-fi, so I can't really think of many. I know there's like floating skateboards and floating shoes.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting there with those. And yeah, there's some areas that I imagine someone predicted, cars and whatnot, but yeah.
Back to the Future didn't get it right.
No, like they didn't. That's very true.
One. I remember reading a book from it was some Disney book from like the 80s, and it was like what will the world look like by the millennium? It was like, so like by the year 2000, and they thought we'd be growing food on the moon.
Oh my gosh. They always go too far, don't they? I remember like, is it Macchio again? I should remember his name. Yeah, the scientist, I forget his name.
Michio Kaku.
That's the one. I need to remember his name. It's the third time I've referenced him in our podcast, and all the time I get it wrong. If there's any very small chance that he watches, sorry. Yeah, so far as I know, he's made some pretty grand claims about what's going to happen in the future, and I don't think any of those have been correct. But
well, there have been some that have been accurate, like 2001: Space Odyssey predicted portable flat screen news pads.
Isn't there a guy at Google that's predicted a hell of a lot?
Yeah, Ray Kurzweil.
Oh, okay, that's him. Okay.
And there's also like Jules Verne predicted, submarines that had high-tech capabilities. There's been a lot of sci-fi predictions. A lot of times, like, you look at the inventions of something like Star Trek, and that oftentimes drives our society to try to push the limits. So people will come along and they'll look at the trend lines of, what is a problem right now that humanity's facing that's potentially solvable through technology, and then they extrapolate out. And futurists do this all the time. They try to figure out, okay, at our current technological advancement rate, how likely are we to hit this by this year? What are we likely to invent? So there was like a think tank in the mid-1900s called the Rand Corporation, and they predicted artificial birth control pills, or birth control pills, artificial organs, and the internet. And there's been a lot of other predictions, some wrong, some not, but generally if it's, kind of close to our technological capability now, we're probably going to accomplish it eventually. Yeah. Especially if there's an economic, drive or an economic need or a problem to solve. I'm going to end on the last quote by Dennis Gaber. The future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. So basically, we can't cast sticks on the ground or stare at someone's palm to try to figure out how the future will be. But if you want something to happen, go out there and create a brighter future on your own or with the help of others. And we'll be back next week with another exciting episode of the Here and How podcast. I believe Steve will be leading that one if he knows his topic.
I don't know my topic yet, but I'm thinking evolution based. So we'll surprise you.
We will surprise you. You will be surprised. Your mind will be blown.
You are the storm.
And on that note, Steve, Rachel, and I will see you guys next week.
Take care.
Bye. This has been an absolute blast, and now we want you to join in the conversation over on the Here and How Facebook and Twitter pages, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram if you just want some of the dankest of sciencey memes. If you like one of our particular styles, check out each of our YouTube channels: Rachel Oates, Rationality Rules by Stephen Woodford, and Holy Kool-Aid by me, Thomas Westbrook. To find all of our episodes, show notes, contact information, and more, warp on over to our home base, thehereandhow.com. If you enjoyed this episode and want us to succeed in spreading the love of science, you can help us out by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. And to all our friends and family listening, thank you for spending this episode with us. We'll be back to explore another exciting big idea next week. Now go create something magnificent.